What does Aperture Laboratories look like? I was inspired to make this video when I saw someone who put all the levels from Half-Life together to form a map of the Black Mesa facility. So I was wondering, could we do the same with Aperture? We know the facility stretches down for miles, but how big exactly is it? Before we find out, I'd like to start by looking at some of the existing maps within the game files. The first one can be found in the first test chamber of Old Aperture. The map shows 6 out of the 9 shafts with all the enrichment spheres and presumably all the other rooms and corridors. It seems like the devs got lazy and simply copy-pasted the same layouts for each shaft. Unfortunately, this map is not complete and it also doesn't show any of the new Aperture. Also, I doubt it is to scale. The second map can be found in co-op mode on one of the CDs. The video shows a radar scanning an area for something. We know that Aperture Science is located in Upper Michigan, so presumably this is a map of that area, although I had trouble finding a place on Google Earth that matches the visuals. I'm also not fully sure what the radar is scanning for. It shows some triangles, but it's not clear what they are. Maybe it's a test subject fault? If anyone has any better ideas, please let me know in the comments. So anyway, both of these maps kinda suck and they don't give us the full picture, so let's make a better one ourselves. Starting off with the first game, I extracted all the levels and stitched them together. Starting with levels 00 and 01, then 2 and 3, but with levels 4 and 5 we're already running into an issue. The geometry of level 4 is clipping into that of level 3. I decided to fix this by manually lifting the test chamber up a little. For the next few chambers everything is looking fine, but with levels 11 and 12 we're once again running into a clipping issue, so I lifted these up too. Then everything is fine again until chamber 18, so let's fix that one as well. And then we have the final chamber where we get sent into the incinerator, but luckily we can escape and enter the backstage area. Now in this area we come across some of the earlier test chambers again. There's a window that overlooks test chamber 14, which in actuality is way down here. We then enter a tube into chamber 9, which is actually down here. As you can see, these chambers are now clipping into each other. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do about this unless Aperture somehow uses invisible portals in its facility. Anyway, moving on, we go through a few more backstage areas. We run into another clipping issue which I fixed by rotating the section 180 degrees. And then we enter the central AI chamber where we defeat GLaDOS. We then get sucked up and end up on a parking lot, which in actuality is right next to the level. We then get shown a cake room, which is actually right below the parking lot. And this is the entirety of Aperture Science as seen in the first game. Let's see what Portal 2 has to add. Luckily for us, in the first level we enter the same place we were shown in the first game, so we can overlap them. Unfortunately, things go immediately, of course, from here on out, because in the first game we take the elevators upwards to GLaDOS' chamber, but in the second game the elevators go down. I'm going to assume that this has been retconned, so let's ignore everything we had before and follow Portal 2's layout. I'm going to have to make a few assumptions here, because where in the first game the transitions were seamless, in the second game the levels are separated by a loading screen, so we don't know how far that elevator travels. For now I'm going to assume that the elevator travels the minimum amount of distance between each level, and I will adjust it later if necessary. I'm also going to assume that the elevators can't twist, so if one level exits with the elevator facing north, the next chamber's elevator should also face north. With that out of the way, let's move forwards until the point where we exit the chambers and re-enter GLaDOS' chamber. I don't like how close it is to the previous chamber, so let's move it away a little. So now we accidentally reactivate GLaDOS and she throws us down the incinerator. This is actually the same incinerator we were in the first game, so it's kind of odd how the central AI chamber is suddenly between chambers 0 and 19, but let's not worry about that too much. We're going to keep moving down for quite a bit until Whitley breaks us out and we enter the backstage area again. There is a little bit of clipping here, but it's just a scenery, so it's not that important. This, however, is pretty bad, so I fixed it by rotating the section. The next part is also clipping, so I'm rotating that too. And then we get to the tube right part, which brings us all the way back to the central AI chamber, which has changed a little since we last saw it. We defeat GLaDOS again and put Wheatley in charge, who then immediately tosses us down an elevator shaft. The shaft itself is actually split up into multiple parts, which are placed next to each other, so I'll have to do a little bit of reassembling. Unfortunately, it's just clipping into a few of the levels from earlier, so let's rotate those out of the way. I'm not breaking any rules here because I'm changing the layout of the hallways, not the elevator. So now we end up in Old Aperture. Now at this point it's located above some of the new Aperture stuff, but we'll fix it later once we know exactly where the top of Old Aperture is. Alright, so we open this massive door and we end up in test shaft 9. We activate a pump and end up in the first test chamber, which unfortunately is facing the wrong way when we enter it. I'm going to have to break rule number 2 and rotate the chamber around the elevator. Let's just pretend that the walkway leading out of the chamber is doing a 180 or something, I don't know. You'll also see that the insides of the enrichment spheres are actually bigger than the outside. I'm going to ignore that for now and fix it later. Next up is chamber 2, which is also facing the wrong way. Then we have chamber 3, which leads us back outside where we reunite with GLaDOS, who is now a potato. Again, it's facing the wrong way, so let's fix that. Next chamber, surprise surprise, is also facing the wrong direction. A little later we exit the spheres again and you guessed it, we're facing the wrong way again. We activate another pump and listen to an old guy rant to us about lemons. And then we actually leave shaft 9 and cross over into shaft 8, where we then exit out the top. But not before we fix another clipping issue. So now we have the entire underground area, but there's one thing we need to look out for. You see, during the falling sequence you pass a bunch of signs telling us how deep we are. At certain points throughout the underground section we come across similar signs. Let's mark those and see how accurate we are. It turns out, not at all, so let's fix that. Let's finally address the fact that the spheres have inconsistent sizes. I simply scaled the exterior so they match the inside. I then added a custom shaft around the spheres. If you remember that map from earlier, it tells us that each shaft has 9 spheres. And if we count them, we only have 7. According to the pumping stations, each pump connects to 3 chambers on either end. Unfortunately, there is no more room to add another sphere to pump station Gamma. But there's plenty of space below it, so let's add 2 spheres right there and assume that we went through them at some point. Let's fill up shaft 8 as well. So now that we know how tall the shafts are, let's shift them down until they're fully below New Aperture. Alright, all that's left is to ascend the elevator and see what Wheatley has been up to. We climb up a few test chambers and at one point Wheatley actually moves one of the chambers closer to him. The central AI chamber is over here, so he's actually moving us slightly further away from him. After a few more chambers, there's this point where the elevator has melted away and we can go behind the scenes again. There's a little bit of clipping here, but again it's just the scenery, so I'm going to ignore it. We then get to the part where he kills us, but fortunately we managed to evade him. A little bit of clipping with some of the earlier levels, but this section will likely be moved later, so let's ignore it. This, however, is pretty bad, so let's rotate this part. The same with the next section. Now we reach the central chamber again. The inside doesn't quite line up with the outside, so let's fix that. We shove some weirdos onto Wheatley and we then shoot a portal on the moon, which is all the way over here. Yeah, it's actually just upside down below the floor, but since that's just a technical hack, I'm going to pretend it isn't there and zoom out to see how close we are to the original chamber location. Alright, we're about halfway there, so let's first line up the final section and then space out the chambers a little. Now we're not fully lined up. To remember that chamber where Wheatley moves us, if we rotate this chamber at 180 degrees, we can increase the distance covered and suddenly we are very close. What I'm going to do to line up the elevators is add an additional test chamber, which we're going to pretend wasn't shown in the game. And that's it! All of Aperture Laboratories. Wait, what? There's more? Yes, that's right. We still have to cover the cooperative testing part. Now, unfortunately there's no overlap with the single player campaign, and there aren't even elevators to connect the chambers, so they could be literally anywhere. We can, however, make some rough estimations based on the visual theme, so that's what I'm gonna do. For convenience, I'm also going to make the assumption that the chambers of each course are grouped together. To start off, we have the introduction level, the hub, and the first course, which look pretty clean, so I'm going to place them somewhere halfway the facility maybe. The next course also looks clean, however we end inside a room with a massive fan in old Aperture, so I'm going to place that just on the border of old and new Aperture. The next course has a somewhat abandoned aesthetic, so I will place it near the surface. Course 4 is clean again, so let's place it somewhere halfway. And then we have course 5, which takes place in old Aperture. It's not clear which shaft we were in, so I'm just going to pick the one next in line. And if you'll notice, we actually cross over into shaft 6 at the end, where we then find a massive vault filled with test subjects. We do, however, need to add one more sphere to shaft 7 to add up to 9. And let's also populate shaft 6. And while I'm at it, I'll add the rest of the shafts as well. Okay, let's zoom out and take a look. I don't really like how old Aperture is facing this way and new Aperture is facing that way, so let's rotate some chambers to make them line up. And finally we have the bonus course for co-op, which seems to take place right on the border between old and new when the company was running out of funds. Which, by the way, where did they get the money from to build this whole new facility on top? Anyway, here we are! This is the entire facility of Aperture Science. At least all that we know of. I know there are still a few more games that take place in a Portal universe, but I don't know if they are canon or not, so I'm not going to cover those. All that's left now is to find out where the surface is. You see, in the first game it is shown that the surface is right above or besides the central AI chamber. But in the second game this has been retconned because GLaDOS is now back in her old chamber, which is now destroyed and it's been moved down. But then when we fight Wheatley we can somehow see the moon, only for the surface to be completely covered in grass immediately after. Luckily for us, we have a few markers that tell us exactly how deep we are. So using that information we can extrapolate where the surface is. If minus 4,000 meters is here, and minus 3,000 meters is here, that means negative 2 kilometers is here, negative 1 kilometer is here, and 0 meters is right here, which is just below the central AI chamber. So if we're talking sea level, this is actually believable. Upper Michigan has an average elevation of about 850 feet or 300 meters, so it's maybe not that accurate to real life, but it's still surprisingly consistent. But with that, I want to thank you guys for watching, and hey, if you made it this far into the video, you should check out my Twitter where I post semi-regular updates on my VR Portal fan project. With some luck I'll be able to publish a demo soon, so stay tuned. But thanks again for watching and goodbye.